Hi, welcome to this week's With Liberty and Justice for Some. I'm Congressman Mark Pocan.
This week's podcast is a little different because we don't have a guest. Instead, everyone who listens is the guest, and we're answering questions that people have given to us on Facebook, Blue Sky, Threads. Uh, I think those are the main formats that we heard from people. And we just want to answer your questions. Specifically, it looks like most people are trying to talk about what just happened with the government shutdown. Today, the House will be voting to reopen the government after the Senate voted to the other day. But there's still a lot of questions, obviously, that are out there. And we want to try to address those so that you can be the best informed about what this actually means, what Democrats are actually still doing, and anything else that people had questions about. I think they range from the Affordable Care Act to SNAP to a couple other subjects. So that's the format for today, and appreciate you listening as always to With Liberty and Justice for Some. So let's have the first question.
Eric on Facebook asks, why did you set an expiration date on the subsidies if you were just going to come back and demand they get extended? Were they COVID related or not?
So, Eric, that's a great question. In fact, that's a question that I think we've seen quite a bit come during the shutdown. And, I think this is the way I'd answer it. I've been in local, state, and federal government. We often will try something and then you have to refine it. You fix it to do what you had tried to accomplish to do with the law. The Affordable Care Act, the idea was to expand healthcare to more people that otherwise couldn't afford it, hence Affordable Care Act. And I think what we found is from when it was first implemented to when we hit that era in COVID, there were a number of people that didn't have access that we had hoped to or intended to make sure they were covered. So, just like we do with many other laws that are sunsetted, you're constantly refining them to make sure they're working accurately. That's what we were doing with the Affordable Care Act. So, there's really nothing special to it other than it was, relatively new. We were making sure that the most people possible were covered. And that's why we were extending those tax credits and making sure that we had the right incomes and types of people covered that otherwise wouldn't have been covered. And that was the intention. So that's it. I know Republicans, for whatever reason, are trying to make it sound like they're COVID related. Clearly, they're not just COVID related. They're making the law work the way it intended, and that's to make healthcare more affordable. What's the next question?
Kathy on Facebook asks, if the Republicans want to do away with the ACA, what, if any, alternatives are they presenting? Or are they just going to leave us in the dust?
Kathy, that's a great question. And here's the answer. They have no clue what they're doing. We know since the Affordable Care Act passed, the Republicans had had no health care plan alternative. In fact, they've talked about having a plan. They've tried many times to get rid of the Affordable Care Act under Speakers Ryan and Boehner, but they've never had an alternative plan. Even Donald Trump, when he was in a debate with Vice President Harris, they asked about a health care plan, and he said they have a concept of a plan. And yet we've never seen that concept either. So what the Republicans did essentially is in the big ugly law, they went in, they cut 15 million people's access to health care, largely through the Affordable Care Act and through the Medicaid plan. And they triggered, by the way, a $500 billion cut to Medicare that doesn't get talked about nearly enough. And all of those actions have made insurance companies look at other uncovered costs they're going to have, and that raised all of our health insurance costs. So, the simple answer to your question is Republicans have no alternative. I think the bigger question is why would you cut health insurance from 15 million people and raise everyone's rates along the way when you have no alternative? And they really have not had an alternative. And that's what the shutdown fight was largely about. We were trying to get those tax credits, those subsidies extended for people. Otherwise, we know that people are going to have their premiums go up $1,000 a month, $2,000 a month in some cases, especially people who are in that 57 to 65 age category. Depending on what plan you're on, they're going to see some of the biggest increases. So to do this without an alternative seems hapless and irresponsible. But the fact that they know they had no alternative and still did this and then still fought us throughout this last 40 some days that we've had a shutdown just shows how little the Republicans care about you and your family. And I think everyone knows, one of the most important things for any family economically is having healthcare. Can you afford your rent or mortgage? Do you have healthcare for your family? Can you maybe take that family vacation? If you don't have those economic fundamentals, you're not getting by and you're not living the American dream, the American promise. And Republicans really don't care about that promise. And don't forget the reason they did all of this, why they took away healthcare, why they took away $180+ billion worth of food assistance through the SNAP program. All of that was to give a tax break to billionaires and to Republican donors. So having no plan as an alternative is terrible, terrible policy. But the Republicans really didn't care. And Kathy, that's the answer on that. What's the next question?
Feller on Facebook asks, why not negotiate these contentious issues in April or May instead of waiting till the last minute, under the pressure of the new FY funding fiasco?
Feller, that's a great question. And one of the many mysteries that I still have after 13 years in Congress is why we wait till the last minute to do absolutely everything. I think it happens because you're able to pressure people sometimes for really bad decisions because there's a lot of special interests in this town often trying to do that. But we don't set the majority, the Republican majority does. So while they've been passing all kinds of bills disapproving of things that Joe Biden did, and we're still doing that, by the way, November, almost a year later, because they have no agenda of anything else. They have never put anything forward to deal with this. And in fact, if we knew that they were going to go after these tax credits, they should have introduced something then, and we could have had a public debate. Instead, it all happened through that reconciliation bill, what they call the big beautiful bill, and we call the big ugly law, because now it is law. And all of those cuts appeared in there with very little public debate about what happened. I can tell you, feller, earlier this year when Donald Trump was stealing funds that for nonprofits and universities and other entities back home, we got a record number of calls. We got up to 300 calls a day in my local office in Madison, Wisconsin. And then within a couple of weeks, we were at 500 calls a day. People got what was happening, but Republican leadership didn't get that. And they weren't trying to put those things out for a real public debate. They just wanted to jam them into this one bill, make us have to take all of these cuts so they could provide a tax cut for their Republican donors. And yeah, that's really the best answer I have. They know these things are bad. Look, I go by the Wisconsin smell test. If they really were doing something good, don't you think they'd get up on the roof with a megaphone and scream it? They would want everyone to know what they did for them. Instead, Republicans have largely hidden in their basements this entire year, not doing public town halls, not reaching out to constituents to talk about these laws. Well, in places like Wisconsin, that doesn't pass the smell test. And I think we really know what they're up to.
Jenny on X asks, how is that Senate deal going to handle ACA credits when even my coffee maker's warranty lasts longer than these temporary fixes?
Yeah, Jenny, to call the Senate deal or what they did in order to reopen anything useful would be a huge overstatement. The best they got out of this was a promise of a Senate vote in December on tax credits, but there's no guarantee of a House vote, and we have very few ways to force a House vote short of a discharge petition. And there, if you don't have enough Republicans to sign it, that'll never happen. And they had no commitment out of the president. So really, it was kind of like, I think I put in social media, it was like getting 2 oxen and a goat and a promise of 4 chickens in the future to reopen government. And there was very little that was substantive that was in that deal. So, every Republican just about voted for that. And 98% of Democrats opposed that. But, there were a few that went along and voted for that agreement. And unfortunately, that means we won't have the answers that we need for people who are going to be facing these huge spikes in the Affordable Care Act. Now, one of my hopes out of all this is maybe people realize that we are the only industrialized nation that doesn't have universal health care. And the only way we can really address that is to look at what other countries have and what we have in this country, which, by the way, the 2 most popular programs I think the federal government does are Social Security and Medicare. And by the way, that's our money, right? We pay into that out of every single paycheck, and the government holds that so we have it when we need it, when we retire, when we need those health benefits. And the fact that there is not a better way to address this, I'm hoping that more people will say, you know what? Medicare works really well. Maybe we just need Medicare for all. Let's not be that only industrialized nation out of every nation on the planet that doesn't have universal health care. We can't. There's no reason we can't. And maybe this will be a debate that triggers a much better discussion about healthcare. What's the next question?
Rose on Blue Sky asks, is there any realistic, emphasizing the word realistic, hope of relief on the ACA tax credits at all?
Oh, Rose, I wish I could give you a more affirmative answer. I think there are some Republicans who give lip service to this, but as long as Donald Trump doesn't want it, I haven't seen a lot of spines in Republican lawmakers to stand up to him. So as long as Donald Trump continues to lie and not have a health care plan and not offer an alternative, I don't know if you're going to see Republicans do the right thing, which is to provide those tax credits again, because you can't just take away health care without having an alternative. And that's what they did. So, of the 22 million people on the Affordable Care Act, the estimate is for those who aren't going to be, who are able to pay all that extra money for healthcare, there will be about 4 million people probably that won't be able to and just outright will lose healthcare. And that's a lot of people. That was the whole idea behind the Affordable Care Act. So, realistic hope. I mean, I think we just all have to keep up that public pressure, reaching out to your member of the House and your two senators, letting them know that you need that healthcare and tell your personal stories. I'll tell you, nothing beats a good, strong personal story. Let them know what your increase was. Let them know what it means to your family, either to have to pay another 1,000 a month and what that means to providing for your family and your kids, or what it means to not be able to afford healthcare anymore and the risks that you're going to have to take that, of course, a member of Congress doesn't, because we have the Affordable Care Act. That's our insurance. We're the only people in the country mandated to have that. So I wish I could give you a more definitive answer, Rose. Unfortunately, we have some work to do on this, but ultimately, I think this is making everyone realize uh, having universal health care is the fix to all of this. A public option in the Affordable Care Act would have been an important fix, and we just need to do more.
James on Facebook asks, if the ACA is/was so affordable, why does it need taxpayer subsidies? This is an honest question.
Yeah, James, let me give you an honest answer. That's the whole idea, is that the problem with healthcare was the affordability, right? And the way it was designed, this was before I got to Congress, was working within the current way we provide healthcare, but providing assistance through tax credits or subsidies for people who couldn't otherwise afford it. And honestly, this is often people like small business owners and other people who, if you don't have a group health plan, group health plans are kind of interesting because you have many people maybe that are in the plan, but maybe there's a couple that are especially sick. Don't forget, before the Affordable Care Act, they could have denied care based on that. Now they can't, because the Affordable Care Act, people forget that that was one of the important provisions that was in the law. But that was the whole idea. By providing those subsidies, it made it affordable for those individuals who otherwise didn't have access to health care. So that's the idea behind it. Look, should they have had a public option? Absolutely. Should we have universal health care? Without question. Am I a supporter of Medicare for all? You bet. Right? There's a lot of ways it could be done, but the votes that they had in Congress at that time were to work within the current system and provide some assistance to people that otherwise weren't able to afford access. And that's 22 million people that benefited from that system. That's big. It's huge. Plus, don't forget, it used to be they could deny people with pre-existing conditions care. Being a woman was a pre-existing condition, believe it or not. People forget if they weren't around prior to when this law came in place. Now, adult children up to 26 can stay on their parents' plans. That wasn't the law previous. That came through the Affordable Care Act. And there's many other provisions that help all of us, not people just on the Affordable Care Act, but all of us who have health care. because of that law. And they have tried to vote, I believe, 70 times to repeal the Affordable Care Act. So they've been trying to do this without an alternative for 15 years, and 70 times they took that vote. And you may remember it was John McCain in the Senate ultimately that saved folks from one of those attempts. So what made it affordable were the subsidies. That was the idea behind the law. I think if we would have added a public option, more people could have had coverage. It would have been better. But 22 million people getting health care is pretty strong. I think that was the grouping of questions we had on the Affordable Care Act. So I just wanted to kind of group them by subject, but I think we have a new grouping, and let's start with those questions.
Ewan Gren on Threads asks, what do you think is the likelihood that Trump will withhold federal funding from Wisconsin to punish us for not undoing the decision to distribute November SNAP benefits?
Wow, trying to predict Donald Trump is difficult, right? He tries to do a lot of things that are often illegal, right? That's why there's over 400 lawsuits against illegal actions by this president that are out there. So, I guess wouldn't be surprised if he tried to do something, but I think he also might want to turn the page a little on this one, because what got lost for a little bit when they stopped benefits were the fact that just months ago, Republicans voted to cut over $180 billion from SNAP benefits. And that put in all kinds of paperwork and restrictions that made it harder to get access. And by the way, in Arkansas, they did some of these changes. And what they found is of people who lost their access to SNAP benefits, food assistance benefits, 70% were still eligible by law, but it was so cumbersome to get the benefits that they simply couldn't get them. And I think that's what we have to remember about what they did. Also, they did some weird things, like a single mom has to work at least 20 hours a week to get benefits if her kid is under 15 years old, or I'm sorry, over 14 years old, so 15 or older. By the way, the House originally on that made that age 8 or older. So if your kid's 8, they're old enough to be independent, while your single mom would have to go work 20 hours a week so you could get $6.20 a day of a food benefit. How ridiculous was that? At least the Senate put a little maturity into the law and went up to the age of 15. But look, there's a lot of restrictive things to make it tougher. You have to keep filing for benefits. You have to do a lot of things that you didn't have to do previously. And again, let's remember the first big lie out of all of this that started the shutdown was that we were fighting for healthcare for, I'm going to say undocumented people. They said illegal aliens. And, we proved in that argument, this went away pretty quick, because by federal law, you cannot, as an undocumented person, access Medicare, Medicaid, or the Affordable Care Act. And for them to be saying that really was just, such BS. In this case, I think, Donald Trump may try to make a point of some states that still offered benefits. But look, I'm glad that Tony Evers in Wisconsin and other states still moved ahead and said they were going to provide benefits to hungry kids and hungry seniors and others who need food assistance. It really was cruel. And Donald Trump was using it as a trying to bludgeon Democrats into reopening government. He didn't care who he hurt along the way. So time will tell. But I think they may want to quit talking about it, because what didn't get talked about as much were those unbelievably massive cuts to food assistance for kids and seniors.
Doug on Facebook asks, why no impeachments, if only to get things on the record?
Yeah, Doug, look, we don't have the majority, right? So unless you think a bunch of Republicans are going to join us, which I do not think a single Republican would join us on impeachment, it doesn't ever get heard, period, because we're not in the majority. That's why elections have consequences. That's why who is in elected office matters. And if we have the majority, not only do we set the agenda and put the votes on the floor, but also we can do the proper oversight of the Trump administration. Look, if Democrats win the majority in the House next November, that means we have oversight. I serve on the Appropriations Committee. Just to give you an example, on one of my subcommittees, Financial Services and General Government Services, we have oversight over things like the IRS and the Postal Service and other federal agencies. But we also have it over the White House, over the Office of Management and Budget, where Russ Vought, who is, by the way, the chief architect of Project 2025, he's been the guy who's been stealing funds against Article 1 of the Constitution that gives Congress the power of the purse. Only because Mike Johnson's been so spineless, he hasn't stood up to the president as he's stolen funds that we've approved in a bipartisan way. But we can have real oversight over these entities if we get the majority. So I think, if the president does something impeachable and we're the majority, we can impeach. But in the minority, if you don't have any Republicans willing to stand up to the cult leader that exists right now in the White House, it doesn't put anything on the record because it'll never even get heard. And that's the largest problem.
Pam on Facebook asks, why did 8 Democrats cave and what was promised to them?
Pam, I don't think anything was promised to them. I think what they think they got in the deal was one, to pay federal employees who've been furloughed. But by the way, that's already the loss. I don't know if that's really a win. They had a protections till January to not fire more people. Well, the president's already fired 200,000 people prior to the shutdown illegally. So I think the courts would have taken care of that. They're getting a vote in December on the tax credits for the Affordable Care Act, but he didn't get a commitment out of the House or the president. So it's kind of like playing fantasy football. I call it fantasy Congress. We're going through the motions, but it'll never be anything. So I don't really consider that a win. I didn't see a lot bluntly in that agreement to reopen government that was what I would call a win. So I don't think that. I think the more important part, though, to stress is every Republican voted for that, and every Republican in the House, minus 1 or 2, will vote for that. And it was only 7 Democrats and 1 independent in the Senate, and I'm guessing a handful or 2 tonight in the House will ultimately vote for that. But 98% of Democrats did not. We're fighting still, and all of us will continue to fight for healthcare and food assistance and education funding and against the tax cuts for the wealthiest. But I don't think there was a promise to those 7 Democrats and 1 independent in the Senate. I think they thought some of those things were wins, but when you look at those, as I mentioned, I don't know if I'd consider any of those actually wins. I think that they just felt there was pain because SNAP benefits were being cut, and the president was not using the contingency fund that Congress created. And even, by the way, the Department of Ag under President Trump admitted that it was Congress's direction to use that fund for emergencies like this, and he was refusing to use it. So I think they just got tired of seeing some of those things happen. But, I think the most important thing is, 98% of Democrats not only held strong, but we're all holding strong to continue to fight for healthcare and food assistance and education funding and everything else that we should.
Jerry on Facebook asks, what is wrong with the Republicans that they are not doing what is right for the American people? Does someone in the White House have such a grip on them that they are afraid to do what is right for the betterment of the American people?
Yeah, Jerry, I'll tell you, I think you hit maybe the central question. Why are Republicans not standing up as a co-equal branch of government that in some cases the Constitution even gives us more power than the executive branch? For example, the power of the purse. When the president's stealing funds, rescission of funds that we've approved as Congress should stand up together in a bipartisan way, and they're not. When the president's doing tariffs, Trump's tariff taxes are hurting all of us on groceries and other goods. It's Congress that has the power over tariffs. The president has the power over emergency tariffs. But it's hard to argue what he's doing are emergency tariffs. I mean, there's no real plan to how he's putting tariffs on. Literally, it's like a monkey in the zoo throwing its dung. You don't know where it's going to land, but it's going to be messy. This seems to be the policy for tariffs. But who pays those tariffs? All of us do, right? The importer brings something in, they pay it, and the cost gets passed on to us, and we're the ones who pay that. So why are Republicans doing things that are against the best interests of their constituents? Well, one, they're acting like a cult. They're following the cult leader, and Donald Trump makes all the calls. And 2, we're not standing up through, again, those constitutional provisions that give Congress the power to do more. And the fact that we're not doing that as a Congress weakens Congress. I mean, in fact, I would argue the 7-week paid vacation the Republicans just had from being in Washington was what Donald Trump wanted, because he's trying to prove Congress doesn't matter. It's him and him alone that matters. And Mike Johnson was just a complicit partner in allowing that to happen. So, there's a reason why 8 million people across the country got together on No King's Day a few Sundays ago, because we're standing up against what we're seeing happen, against what the Congress is allowing, the congressional majority is allowing the president to do. And that's why I guess the best recourse we have, one, always call your member of the House and your two senators, as well as your state legislators, by the way, and other local elected officials. But two, next November, we all have the power to stand up to that and really make a difference.
Robert on Facebook asks, what concrete steps will you take within the Democratic Party to ensure that the senators responsible for caving in will face consequences for doing so?
Well, I think, what we're trying to focus on is the future, right? I don't think we have anything you can do other than the voters in those districts have something they can do if they're not happy with the decisions made by their elected officials. But being in the House, I have no power over anything that happens in the Senate, although I think I've been rather outspoken in saying that this was an awful deal, that I think, the Senate leadership is complicit by not either stopping it or if they were any way complicit in making it happen, that is weak and shows weakness. And that's not what we needed coming out of the Senate at this point. I think we had momentum. The public was with us on healthcare. I mean, obviously, it's so important to everybody. But this is going to be a decision that ultimately Democratic senators make within their caucus, but also the voters of New York State. Everyone's accountable via election on a regular basis, the Senate a little less often, but that may be the best way to get that accountability.
Jeb on Blue Sky asks, do you agree with Rep. Khanna that Schumer needs to be replaced?
Basically said, I think I said next, time for next a person to kind of get in there. I mean, that was a huge mistake. There's no way Nancy Pelosi or Hakeem Jeffries would ever have had something like that happen on their watch, right? I think the whole idea that either you knew about it and did nothing or quietly encouraged, or you looked like you were hapless and couldn't stop it from happening. Look, I understand. I talked to a senator I respect recently who said every senator thinks they have more power than they have, and I think every House member thinks they have less power than they have. And I think, in that case, those senators independently went and tried to cut whatever deal they think they're cutting. And I think sometimes you get in the middle of it and you start to lose scope of why the fight started and what you were fighting for, which was healthcare for the American people. But I think we need leaders who would have stood up with every ounce of strength they had to fight against making a bad deal on reopening the government and use the leverage that we had to get affordable health care. I mean, to get those tax credits, those subsidies put back in place so 4 million people didn't lose their health insurance, but all of us are paying more for health care because of it, and we could have done something about it.
Our Tomps 23 on Blue Sky asks, going from feeling invigorated after the wins on November 4th to feeling rightly defeated after the loss on November 9th, what will Democrats do to earn the trust of their base again?
I understand because I'm upset as well with what happened. But this is one where I think we have to take the power that we have individually and remember the power we have. Look, I think we has had a couple really, really big wins. First of all, we're having some big wins in the courts, right? Our founders knew what they were doing, and our system of law has had, I think, almost 200 overturnings of actions that Donald Trump has done through legal cases. And that's really significant and important. But the two things that I think really stood out to me that happened were all people powered. Because again, we have limits on what we can do in the House, short of a discharge petition. You're not in the majority. Unfortunately, elections have consequences. But here's the two things we did. On October 18th, on No King's Day, 8 million people came out and protested against this president and the Republicans in Congress for how they're running government. And I don't think there's ever been a protest that size in the history of the country. That was us, people power on that, making that statement. Second, was honestly the Jimmy Kimmel case. When Disney was trying to do a merger and trying to get the federal government to kind of agree to that merger, and there was a little bit of a threat there, they fired Jimmy Kimmel, and we all got pissed, rightfully so. But no group, no one organized what followed in the coming days. People from all over the country canceled their Disney and Hulu and ESPN subscriptions, to the point that within a couple days, Disney lost $4 billion of value, and they had to cave. And we did that. No politician, no political party, no organization organized that. We did that. And then they put Jimmy Kimmel back on the air, and guess what happened? That night, gave the biggest verbal FU to the president, and the next night, and the next night, and the next night. And that's what's really important, is what we saw was our power in action. It worked. It forced this mega corporation to its knees. And to Jimmy Kimmel's credit, probably the highest profile person nationally to go back and take him on. So, I think the most important thing to remember is in those individual districts and states, people are going to deal with their elected officials, but we can continue to fight back in the ways that we have, in the ways that we've won. And I think that's really important.
Julie on Facebook asks, now what?
Short and sweet, Julie. Now what? Yeah, I'll tell you, this is where, we just have to keep fighting, keep strong. People need healthcare. And unfortunately, that Republican big ugly law is going to cost 15 million people their healthcare. We're all going to pay more for healthcare under this law. I just talked to one Madison employer this month who told me that their group rate increase for next year is 41% because of that big ugly law. Food assistance. We know that the number one program keeping kids out of poverty is the SNAP program, and yet $180 billion plus cut to it is going to greatly affect people, and that's a huge problem. We know there's cuts to education. We haven't really talked much about that, to financial aid. All of this was done in that big ugly law in order to provide tax cuts to Republican donors and billionaires. And we need to hold elected officials who voted for that accountable. And we have to be constantly reaching out to our elected officials and being heard. I can tell you every single week, I get a report of how many people reach out to the office via phone, email, or letters, what the top few subjects are, I think top 10 in each area, the numbers, so I can kind of get an idea where people are at. I'm not the only person. I think almost every elected official in both parties does that. So it's important you continue to reach out to your elected officials. And finally, politics isn't a spectator sport. Get involved. If you really care, work against the politicians that are voting against your interest, and work for people who will have your back. And I think that's the efforts that we have that we can still do. And that's, I think, what's next for all of us. So I believe, Julie, that was the last question that we had. When we just put out for, I think, Monday, we put out a little question to see what you were thinking about right now, you wanted to hear from. We're putting it out this week, hours before we're going to vote on the reopening of government from the House side. I'm assuming that's going to happen because I think Republicans will largely all be lockstep there to do that. But the fight's not over at all. And now the fight just kind of goes back to all of us. We all need to keep taking on the Disneys of the world. We need to keep reaching out to our elected officials and putting pressure. If you're from Wisconsin, one of those little provisions that got snuck into this deal to reopen government was to give 8 Republican senators the ability to sue the government for $1 million if their phone numbers information was given out as they were doing things like Ron Johnson from Wisconsin, when he was contemplating releasing a fake set of electors and giving those to the vice president. Now Ron Johnson has the ability to sue for $1 million. I think some other action may take that away because that was absolutely ridiculous and probably illegal. But some think that's just setting up Donald Trump to get his $230 million from the federal government that he's trying to get for his illegal actions when the government went after him and he had to spend money on lawyers. So we've got a lot to continue to fight. I guess the last thing I would say is don't chase every shiny object. Donald Trump is great at putting a lot of lures out there for us, wants us to jump on every argument, but we have to be strong, and we have to keep focused as much as possible. To me, the biggest issues are affordability, what we're paying too much for groceries and durable goods because of Trump's tariff taxes. We're paying too much for healthcare and energy costs because of the big ugly law. We're still paying too much for housing costs. We need to fight on those fronts, and obviously for our democracy and other things that happen, but keep the eye on the prize. Let's keep focused as much as possible. I am confident, based on the elections Tuesday, based on the turnout, at that No Kings rally on October 18th, based on what we did with the Jimmy Kimmel situation, that we're going to win this ultimately. It's going to be a little ugly along the way. It would definitely be some speed bumps, but we just have to continue to be active and don't take no for an answer. We got to keep fighting. And I think we're going to come through this, and hopefully we come out of this stronger. I mean, just on healthcare alone, have we not just made the greatest argument ever in the last decade for a system of Medicare for all? Absolutely. And I think we can use these things to help move other smart public policy forward. So that's this week's podcast. We made it a little different than usual. Just answering some questions from you all. We'll get back to our normal format next week. We've got some great interviews coming up, but thanks for listening. And hopefully this helps provide a little information during this really uncertain times with the government reopening, what the fight was about, what we still have to get done, but the fact that we can get it done is what matters. So thanks much for listening and have a great day.